Good morning, people, on this lovely March day. We join again
This is
for
the sun coming
another
out. It looks a bit brighter out now, just at the moment. It was raining earlier.
for another interesting topic. Today, we have in conversation with another of our talks. This time, very interesting. Patsy will be speaking to Marian Liebmann, who a person I've known for a few years, and I know it will be an interesting hour. Patsy.
Thank you, Ray. Hello, Marian. It's
Uh,
lovely to have you with us. I'm aware you've had a very interesting life, and I'm looking at the standard questions I ask, and they're frankly a bit thin compared with the things you'll be able to tell us. But I shall leave it to you to fill out where I fail to ask the right questions. But I was thinking perhaps we could start by learning a bit about where you were born, what it was like for you growing up, because like me, you were born during the war.
yes, I don't have very many memories of the war, apart from the odd one of sort of sitting in an air raid shelter. Um, but I do remember sort of going around with my mother afterwards, and the grown-ups all had this funny phrase that they would say. It was called "before the war." Didn't know what it meant, but it was a phrase that was rolled out before the war. This, before the war, that, and I never knew what it meant till much, much later. So I was born in Cambridge, and during the war, and my brother was born just after, and in a way, it was kind of quite ordinary kind of childhood. But except we didn't have any relations because my parents were Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, and most of the rest of their families got killed. So we had my grandmother who spoke a language that we called Immigranto. It was kind of English spiced with German words every so often, and she never really learnt to speak English properly. But she refused to teach us German. I could have been bilingual, but I'm not. And from about the age of 10, she would moan that I couldn't speak German. But you know, when I was much younger, she wouldn't teach us. So I think she she was brought over after Kristallnacht, but she was the only relation that I thought I had until I met my cousin, who came on the kinder transport at the age of 6. And he came through London, but my mother missed him. She was looking out for him, and she thought he'd been adopted, and that the adopted parents didn't want to know about previous family, as was the custom then. That was, I think, not unusual. So after a bit of a search, she gave up. But meanwhile, he wasn't adopted; he was fostered, and he always knew he had an aunt in England. And why didn't she come and find him? And through totally chance things, actually, when my father died, and notices went in the paper, as they did then, somebody showed up from the past. It was my mother's sister's best friend, and they got talking, and it turned out that her son knew somebody of the right name. And by, making a long story short, we met when I was 20 and he was 30. So all the time in school, people would say, "Have you got any cousins? Have you got any aunts and uncles?" And I'd say, "No, I don't, but I think I might have a cousin somewhere." So I mean, that did mean that we didn't you we didn't have any other relations to go and stay with or do things with. And I think my parents' friends were mostly other refugees. So when my father died and my mother needed space to sort things out, we were sent for 6 weeks to be with some other friends, people that Roger knew, I think, who were in Bromley. But that was a kind of childhood. And then school was kind of ordinary. And then we moved to Aldermaston when I was about 8. and that was to do with my father's job. He was a research scientist. Both my parents were physicists, and I think my father was quite well known. Because he died when I was 14, I didn't really know him in terms of his work. Much later, my mother gave me a set of his papers, and there were 50 of them. And even though I did a physics degree myself, I wouldn't even pretend to be able to understand them. They're full of graphs and equations and all sorts. And he, shortly before he died, he did a big lecture tour in America. So he was quite well known in his field.
So I'm so sorry, Marian. I don't know if I should have interrupted or not. You were cycling the
I cycled 2 or 3 miles to the main A4 Bath Road, which was carried all the traffic between London and the West. And then I would tie my bike up by a pub or a garage and get on a bus all the way to Newbury, about 10 miles. And then I would get off at the clock tower and walk up to my school about sort of 15 to 20 minutes. And then all the way back, the same thing on the way back, except I had to go to the bus station because otherwise the bus was full. I mean, and then later when my brother came to the same school, he was younger and not very responsible, so my mother used to take us every day. And then I went to secondary school in Reading because my parents were going to move, and so I spent my secondary education till 16 at the Abbey School, Reading, which is I think a direct grant school. And then I went to Clifton High School, and that was because when my father died at 14, my mother was ill, and we weren't getting on that well, and she managed to get my brother into the local school as a boarder, and so it was deemed that I should go to boarding school. She didn't really think of it. Can you hang on a minute? There's horrible noise going on outside, right outside. I can't do anything about it.
That's
I
right.
hope it won't affect the recording.
Can't hear it.
Good.
We can hear you all right, I think.
Yeah. So when my father died and my mother was getting my brother into the local school as a boarder, she mentioned that she wasn't very happy about the science teaching for girls in Reading. And the local authority said, "Have you thought of boarding school?" She said, more or less, "Don't be stupid. I'm a recent widow. I'm having to go out to work for the first time for years and years. I can't afford boarding school." They said, "You find the school, we'll pay the fees." So that's what happened.
Wow.
So I spent my sixth form at Clifton High School. Well, that's all about education, which is perhaps not totally interesting, and it was quite conventional. I think I got funneled into science simply by elimination and having no careers advice. So that I did everything up to O level, was pretty good at everything, and I chose science because I thought I could keep up art subjects on my own, but I couldn't keep up science subjects on my own. I was, but then sort of in those times when people thought that science and arts were two opposite things, I then got labelled as being a scientist who couldn't possibly do languages or art or anything. And so I remember going from the school where I'd done O levels, where everybody did everything, to Clifton High School, where they had this philosophy where you could do one, you couldn't do the other. So they couldn't understand how I had good grades in languages, but was doing science A levels. So, but that was then. Unfortunately, that kind of philosophy, I think, has kind of gone on its way. And certainly, when my daughter was choosing A levels, she was able to choose something like physics, chemistry, geography, and photography. And her friend Tim chose physics, maths, and art. So You know, I think that's sort of a lot more flexible, thank goodness. So, yeah. So, I mean, really, we were just a small family, kind of quite isolated in lots of ways, just trying to get on with life. And I think my parents were kind of they tried very, very hard to assimilate. So they did all sorts of things like have us sort of christened to be Church of England, just to blend in. I sometimes joke and say now, if you want somebody to blend in, you put a sponge in their hands for washing the car on Sunday mornings. But you know, that was sort of, you know, wartime England. And they were just very, very conscious of having found a safe haven and trying to do their best to do all the things that British people did and to bring up their kids to do the same.
Yeah.
So
Was it an issue for you trying to decide what to study at university, given that the school had tried to section you off into different bits?
well, yeah, it was. I mean, I think because the way it worked was, you know, so you chose your A levels, so because it was science, it was physics, chemistry, maths. Oh, I think physics, chemistry, and two maths. And then it was a question of which one of those to pursue. And I didn't like the chemistry teacher. It was boring. And I didn't think I was good enough at maths, so that left physics. Now, you know, if I'd had some decent advice, I probably should have done something that was much more across the board, whether it would be architecture or social sciences or anthropology or sociology or psychology. Any of those that go across the board would have been much better. But yeah, there wasn't any such thing as careers advice. If you were the only careers advice you got was if you were clever, you went to university. And that was you taken care of. And if you were not so clever, you were either going to be a nurse or a secretary.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
So you know, so there was zero advice really.
Yeah.
And I did find that sort of when I got a physics degree and thinking that I wanted to do something more general, that when I applied for jobs, they would say, "Well, you're a scientist, you can't possibly do this job." Which is, I think, why I went into teaching, because it seemed to kind of combine the two. But I wasn't a very good class teacher. I couldn't do the mob control. So I'd be very busy, sort of concentrating on helping one little child, struggling with some bit of teaching maths, because that's where the gaps were. And I wouldn't even notice that there was mayhem going on the other side of the classroom. So I looked for a way out, and then I joined a company writing schools materials, and I could do a lot with art then. There were sort of programs for maths, but you could illustrate it with lots of pictures. But it was a bit ivory towerish, so then I wanted to kind of get back to people, and I managed to find a job at a day centre for ex-offenders. And I really enjoyed that job. I did a bit of everything. I'd also started doing maths and literacy teaching in St Werburgh's. I got when I moved to Bristol with the job. I had a brief spell in London, which I didn't enjoy at all. But then I moved to Bristol, and somebody wanted some help running a maths scheme for African Caribbean immigrants who were trying to go on skill centre courses, but they didn't have enough maths. And then people started coming along wanting help with English, and so I teamed up with somebody who was a primary school teacher, but with experience of teaching English to non-English speakers. And then I got to know quite a bit of that. And so when I worked at the day centre for ex-offenders, which is in Gloucester, I was able to teach numeracy and literacy. And that was very interesting. Before it was before the BBC programme when it wasn't even recognised. There were lots of people who couldn't read and couldn't do simple arithmetic, but there wasn't any recognition of it. So I kind of built that up, and then I was also doing the art side as well, and that's what got me interested in art therapy. Because I'd always done art as a hobby, but if you have immigrant parents, art stays as a hobby. You have to get a proper solid career. And we see it now with the Asian community. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, and a scientist just about gets in there. But the solid careers that this is what you should be doing. And then when I was working at the day centre, I remember friends of my mother saying, "What are you doing with all those rubbish people? Can't you do something better?"
People used to say things like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so then I did an art therapy course, and I couldn't get an art therapy job for quite a while. So I looked around, and I worked for victim support. That was a real eye opener. After working with offenders, working with victim support, which was just starting. Bristol was the first place. I wasn't the originator, but I was their second coordinator. That they did the classic thing of realizing that they couldn't expect a volunteer to do it anymore. So they needed to pay somebody, but since the committee didn't agree about it, half thought it was to stay as a voluntary job, and half said, no, you need to pay someone. The classic thing of paying somebody half a salary. And I mean, Anna was a baby then, and so and we worked from home, which I didn't mind. I quite liked that. I didn't particularly like it when they moved us to Central Hall, which I don't know if anybody remembers Central Hall in the kind of olden days. It absolutely stank of pee, because it was where most homeless people sort of found a place of shelter, and was very difficult to get to. But then I did the social work course, specialising in probation, and I was worked in probation for several years. And then I just before I finished with victim support, I discovered mediation. Somebody gave me a slip of paper, scruffy slip of paper, saying, "I think this is for you," and it was about a mediation course in London, run by two people from the Philadelphia Quaker project. And I went on the weekend, and all the lights came on in my head, and I've been pursuing it more or less ever since. And for me, it was quite important, because I've never been very happy rushing about protesting. I always found it quite difficult to kind of put myself on one side or the other. I'm always thinking about, well, yes, you could protest about this, but what if the other side has a point? So, but to do mediation seemed, because I was already involved in Quakers, it seemed like a better fit for me, than the kind of protesting type sort of piecework. And that's I think been the case sort of all along. And I think sort of most people probably know all the things that I've done in that line anyway. So then a job came up with Mediation UK, and I applied for it and didn't get it. And then 6 months later, they said, "Oh, the person you chose has gone to America, so will you do it?" And then it was very interesting and exciting, but it was it meant traveling a lot, and I learned an awful lot, but it wasn't very good for the home life. And Anna had quite a few teenage problems, as some people here may remember. And so I sort of dropped to part-time doing project work, and then sort of managed to get an art therapy job alongside it. So for quite a few years, I was doing both. And then when Mediation UK was short of money and sort of pulled their horns in, then I carried on doing mediation training work, freelance, alongside my art therapy job. And then that was the time when restorative justice was just about sort of beginning to gain some traction with the then new Labour government. So I did a lot of training work. And then in my art therapy job, that was with the inner city team, and that was always very, very interesting, because all sorts come through, numbers of different kinds of people, you know, whether from all different backgrounds, sort of white people, brown people, black people, all different. You could never tell who was going to be referred. There was a bit of prejudice in the referral system, for quite a while. The black members of the team wouldn't refer black clients because they assumed wrongly that I used the kind of Eurocentric therapy models that most art therapists and other therapists had been brought up on, like Freud and Jung and Klein and so on. But I deliberately didn't, because I could see that they didn't really tell the whole story. They were of their time, and they had lots to teach us, but they were not suitable for many of the people that I met. So it took me a while to kind of persuade people that I was doing you know, I wasn't doing that. I was actually looking a bit wider, things like, you know, narrative therapy, and all sorts of other, and mainly starting from the people. You know, people would arrive with all sorts of diagnoses, which really meant very little. Much more productive to sit somebody down and say, "So what's the problem? How can I help?" And then we could usually work out some good ways. I've ended up being regarded as a bit of a specialist with anger, not because I'm a particularly angry person. I do get angry, but it was a kind of another little accident of history. In probation, when I worked in probation, we had various groups, and a lot of them I didn't enjoy very much, because when we were doing a group about people who'd offended in driving just by, you know, having either bald tires or no insurance or various things like that, you were really telling people to be patient, because driving is a legal activity. But when people are actually beating somebody up, you know, I actually do believe that there should be, or there is, another way. And if you find that, then you don't need to beat people up. So I actually enjoyed, if that's the right word, the anger groups. And then I was able to transfer that to the art therapy situation, when a consultant came into the room, big open plan room, and said, "Oh, I've got all these angry clients. Anybody here work with anger?" Suddenly everybody found their admin unusually interesting. But I heard myself say, "I do." So he was 17 clients. Well, a lot of people here will know there's a difference between a complainant and a client. So a lot of people who are angry, they don't think they have a problem. Or as one person said to me after a fruitless conversation, "I don't have a problem with my anger, just everybody else keeps winding me up." So the 17 soon whittled down to about 6, but I ran several groups and I've written quite a bit about it. So if anybody's interested, it's all in the books. So I keep carrying on talking, but it's probably more interesting if Patsy asks me a couple more questions.
I have thought of various things as we went along that I'd like to ask you about. Your piecework, for example. I don't know if you could say a little bit more about that in general.
Um, well, I mean, the mediation work, a lot of it has been with neighbours in Bristol. And I mean, some of it is, you don't win them all, but sometimes you can actually get people to agree. They don't necessarily want to be friends, but occasionally even that happens.
Mm.
You know, I've sort of I've been I've done it for quite a long time. And it has got more difficult because I think people hang on to cases, and housing officers hang on to cases until they can't cope with them.
Mm.
But it's worth doing because otherwise either people are going to get evicted, or they're going to get taken to court, or they're just going to carry on making their neighbours' lives more difficult. And I've been involved in kind of quite a lot of work in other countries, but people think it's bringing political sides together, but mostly it's been in the criminal justice system.
Mm.
Because for some reason that I still don't quite understand, when people have had a war and they come to putting things right afterwards, they often seem to think they've got to redo their youth justice system. So that was true in Serbia. So I did about 3 years. For 3 years, I went every year for about 6 weeks in different chunks, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and did a lot of training. In the end, I think I must have trained about 180 people, and I trained 50 of those to be trainers as well. But unfortunately, the leader of the project went to America for a year, but never came back. And I don't know what's happened to it. I think that they did introduce a law for youth justice, making it possible, but I don't think they ever got round to doing the administrative setup to make it, to sort of make it all over the country. But very interestingly, you think of Serbia, well, I did, as quite a punitive country, but when it came to actually the youth justice system, they were appalled at the punitiveness of the British system. They couldn't believe how many young people we put in prison. And they were interested in restorative justice because they thought their system needed toughening up. Because unless it was so serious that they did send them to the one juvenile prison, their idea of supervision was a social worker comes by once every 6 months. So you could see that people might think that wasn't quite enough. Whereas in Britain, people think of restorative justice as a big let off and a kind of sort of soft option. And I mean, even their juvenile prison, where I did quite a lot of work, it was kind of run on a kind of homely sort of basis. There would be sort of children about 12 or 13 who would be running up to the leader of it and holding his hand. And he would be like a kind of, a sort of benevolent uncle. So it was, so they were kind of quite different sort of on the ground to how they are politically. So that was very interesting. But there was also there were also quite a lot of difficulties. They all thought I was mean because I couldn't understand the language, so I couldn't take part in when they were buying rounds of copies. I eventually solved that by going to a supermarket, which were only just starting, and buying a box of biscuits and handing them around at odd intervals. And then they thought I was interesting. I was being super honest about the expenses, and so I had a year-round insurance policy, but I was carefully carving it up into little bits for each trip, proportionately. And they thought this was ridiculous because surely, being from the West, I was rich, and surely the fees they were paying me were, the top whack, and surely I didn't need such small sums. But actually, the top whack there was about half the going rate of Britain. There was quite a lot of it, so it was quite a it was quite a good chunk of earnings for me, but it wasn't because it was paid at huge rates. So that took a while. I thought, what should I do about that? So I thought, well, the best thing is next time I have a trip is to put the total sum of the annual insurance onto that one trip. I did that, not a murmur, because it was sizable enough to to see that I might need that. So
How did you manage? You obviously did manage very well, but your family and your career, they
well, because I got married to Mike, who was just such a lovely man, and he didn't really he didn't really sort of mind about careers. He always joked and said that career was the one word in the English language that he couldn't spell. Because I mean, he did have flawless English and was really a great help when I was editing books. But he was a chemist, and he hadn't managed to kind of get very good jobs. He came to Bristol to do update himself, and after that, he just wasn't able to get any decent jobs because it was a master's, and he found that he was too expensive for people who wanted somebody with just a basic ordinary degree, and he wasn't qualified enough to go alongside all those young people with PhDs. So he actually found it very, very difficult getting a job, and he ended up working for British Aerospace, not in the dynamics division, which was weapons, but in the civil aviation, and analysing liquids. He once very proudly pronounced that some dangerous looking liquids that they'd found in between the inner skin and the outer skin of an aircraft. He did all the usual tests and pronounced that actually it was just pee and leaky loo. But he was very, very clever, very good at languages, just a range of interests to me, but much more on the environmental side. He was before his time. He was going on about the environment way back before anybody thought it was an issue at all. And he didn't get much traction for that. He was regarded as an eccentric oddity for that. So I've got quite a collection of books I probably ought to give to somebody who's currently engaged in that field. So he was, but because of that, when we when we had our daughter, we wanted to share the care, partly because he was he was just very keen to be a parent. Me, not so much, and I had real doubts about whether I would be a good parent, partly because of my own upbringing. I think I had suffered quite a bit at the hand of my mother. She wasn't well, but she did used to beat me up when I was about 8. So I was just worried that I was going to do all those kind of things. Didn't, I shouldn't have, but people do carry these things around. So I thought, well, at least if I share it with somebody else, I can minimize the damage. So then Mike was unemployed, and so he was at home, and if it had to be any way round, it was a better way round, because I was more able to get a job than he was. I think if we'd been able to have it how we would have liked it, I think I would have worked for 2/3 of the time, and he would have worked for 1/3 of the time. But that wasn't open. He tried to get a job share. He did a lot of work on job sharing again when it was not at all fashionable. And his a whole stack of things about job sharing and shared work and how productive that could be. And he even found a partner to do it with. It was a woman wanting to return to work after having children. But British Aerospace said no. We expect proper men to want proper jobs. And so we're not entertaining that idea at all. And so, he then when I went looking for a job, that was when we found victim support. We actually shared that job, but the management committee were not very nice to him. And in the end, I had to leave because I was being made to work full time when I didn't want to. Yeah, and then he was at home. He was a much better homemaker than me, so so it didn't matter that I was away a lot, but it did because although Mike was absolutely lovely, and absolutely a wonderful parent of a baby, he wasn't so good when it came to saying no. And so, you know, our daughter basically ran riot around us, and could have done with a firmer hand. But you know, economically, we couldn't manage it. If I'd given up my job and sort of said, right now, let's get things in order here, you know, we wouldn't have any money. Mike wouldn't have had a role. We'd have been quarreling all the time. So I just thought, well, you have to put up with it, how it is, and Anna will have to find her own way.
Sounds like a pretty good arrangement.
Yeah.
I'm aware that you were going to show some photographs.
Oh yes, I was.
I'm a bit anxious because have we got David back? David popped out.
There he is, but he's on mute.
Yes, my internet died on me. I had to. So
Okay.
we will have lost a few minutes of the recording, I'm afraid. But I'm here now.
I clicked on as soon as I realised, but there might be a few minutes missing. So how do you, can Marian do the photographs herself with this arrangement, or
No, I will share the screen because I've got the pictures.
Yeah.
And then Marian will have to tell me to move. They're in the order that she sent them to me. So shall I share the screen now?
Yes. So first the one of my mother, and then the one of my father, which are just portraits.
Okay. Is that coming up?
Yes, that's my mother.
yeah.
Right. And just a moment. I have to.
That was taken on holiday in Austria.
I've got another window sitting here that I need to get rid of. I got a participant window showing. That's it, right? Okay, so that's your mum. We have to find your dad. I guess this is
the one.
him.
That's the one.
Yeah,
that's my dad. About the same time. These were both more or less as we were growing up. So then there's and the only family photo that I could find has got 4 of us in a row. That's the one.
Oh yes.
So 12 there. So you've got my father and mother, me, and this the older person was my father's sort of nanny, not a relation, but the person who looked after him when he was a child in Germany.
Oh, great.
And he wanted to see her one last time as she was getting older, and so we went on holiday to Austria, and we stopped off in Munich, and this is at the station. That's me, age 12. And then we'll have my brother, Steve.
Be him?
That's him. That's him in later life, not as a child, because all the photos of him are, you know, on little bits of cardboard. So he was a great sailor. He's at the helm of his boat. And we got on very well as children. He was 3.5 years younger than me. Not so much as adults. I think he didn't really rate the kind of work that I was doing. Kind of very much sort of, he did electronics and then did sort of electronics journalism, and then went into money sort of investment on the scientific side. He would judge firms from their scientific point of view. So he was an investment analyst, and then in his spare time he was sailing as much as he could. And unfortunately, he died. He died at age 64 from cancer of the esophagus. I was very shocked because he'd hardly ever been ill in his life. You know, I was the one who was quite sickly as a child, and spent lots of time in bed doing jigsaw puzzles and sort of maths books and things. But he was always bouncing with health, and then he got cancer of the esophagus. So I can't believe it. So that was about 10 years ago now. But there he is, as absolutely on his beloved boat. And so now we have, yes, we've got one with a big house, which is what my parents built.
Hopefully, is that it?
That's the one, yes.
Hmm.
So that's in Reading, and we were living in Aldermaston because that was where the research lab was that my father was working at. But then the atomic place started building up, and they didn't really like living 100 yards from the bunkers where the atomic explosions were being tried out, and so they wanted to move into Reading. They looked at endless houses, very, very boring weekends they were, and in the end they decided that none of them met their wishes, and they designed their own, which is this one, and they had it built. And so that we were months and months having it built. But it was a very nice house in lots of ways, had lots of good things. So my bedroom's top right, my brother's was the next one along, and my parents' one was the top left. And then there was a little sun porch that my mother used to sit, the garage, and table tennis table, and the car wasn't in there, and then a really big back garden with a nice bit of wood where we built tree houses. So, and there's two more. One is of a big old house in Berlin. That's the one. This is where my parents lived before they emigrated. This is on a visit back to where I went. I helped my mother do her memoirs when she was 70. And then I wanted to go to Berlin to see if I could find all the places she mentioned. This was the only one that still, all the rest seemed to be built over. There were, new shopping centres, new schools, new community centres. But this one looked like it hadn't been touched since 1937 when they left. And I would have liked to find the actual flat, but I didn't quite have the nerve to knock on the doors inside. And then the last picture is of two Stolpersteiner, that's right. So this came about, I don't know how many people have heard of Stolpersteiner. Anybody put their hands up if they have?
No.
Okay, I'll explain. At some point, probably about 20 years ago, maybe, an artist called Gunther Demnig thought that there should be some way of commemorating all the people who'd been sort of taken from their homes and sent to concentration camps. And so he started this, putting little plaques in the ground of where their last residence was. And I thought, well, it's just for people who died, who were murdered. But then my cousin told me that he'd had ones done for his side of the family. And when I looked them up, he was included. And I said, but you're still alive. And so they had extended it to refugees. So then I got in touch and tried to get something moving. Didn't seem to work. Didn't seem to get much response. And then there was one of those Bristol Ideas sessions, Bristol Future City seminars, 3 days ago, and I saw that they had a session on memorials, including somebody from the Stolperstein project. So I sort of cancelled whatever else I was doing, got myself along to that. And they said, oh, the person who's liaising with you, he died last year. And we didn't have access to any of his work. So I'll make sure to get that put right. And then, it took 3 or 4 years after that to get things sorted. And I had to write great chunks of sort of stuff to go on their website. So if anybody's wanting to read about my parents, then it's all on the Stolpersteiner website. And so here they are. Here are the plaques. I couldn't go to the ceremony because it was during COVID. So we went later. We went in April 2022. It was the first time we could go, and I sort of took Anna and Anna's husband and the 2 grandchildren, and we had a little ceremony outside the house. And Kate Sturge would have been there to welcome us. Is Roger still with us?
I think that's correct. Roger, are you there?
He's there.
Yes,
unmute
okay.
it.
Yeah,
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
And yes,
yes. And Kate would have been there, but she was en route to Bristol because Hilda was just dying. So, but she sent along a friend of hers, and there was a strange man. We thought he was somebody from the house, but he wasn't. And he introduced himself, and I can't remember his name now, but but he accompanied us and then invited us back for a cup of tea to his to where he was living. So that was very interesting. I think it was very good for the grandchildren as well. So I think that's the end of the pictures anyway.
Oh,
Can I just
sorry,
can I
sorry.
just say that on the Stolpersteiner, Kate and her wife join the team that goes around polishing them twice a year. I think it's twice a year. Whether they, I don't think that Marian's parents are on her patch. Not all that far away, but
Yeah,
it's
they do get tarnished very quickly because the
quite.
Stolpersteiner representative who came to host us had brought cleaning stuff with her, and they were already tarnished only after a few months. But I think they're a good idea. Some people don't agree with it.
I think they're brilliant.
think
Very moving to see them
Yeah.
walk around Berlin, as do Turkles do quite a lot,
Yeah.
and it's very impressive to see just how many people were affected.
Yeah, and of course, when you go, the house where my parents' ones are have several little clusters of Stolpersteiner, not more than the ones houses next door, and that's because there was a Jewish landlord who was prepared to let a flat to my parents, which was not necessarily the case up and down the road.
One question, if I may ask.
Yeah.
Why Quakers?
Oh, well, I didn't have a religious upbringing at all, but my my parents were secular people. They I think they would have left the Jewish community, in fact, if it hadn't been for Hitler, because they really didn't feel they had that much in common. But then somebody whisked us off to Sunday school, and so we kind of got into the kind of system, and I went to a church secondary school, and got confirmed in the Church of England. And then when I was about 18, it all just started to unravel, really. And so although I was sort of still taking part in stuff at Oxford, I was getting more and more disillusioned. And then all the disillusion used to fetch up at Oxford Quaker Meeting House. So I had a kind of passing sort of acquaintance with Quakers. And then my friend, my best friend there, she joined, and so when I went to stay with her for weekends in Worcester, then I went to Quaker meeting. And then I discovered that my cousin Eva was a Quaker. She'd always had a reputation she was second cousin, but she'd always had a reputation of being a bit of a religious maniac. So I assumed she was some kind of evangelical. And then we had a big family meeting in London where she came, a distant cousin from America came, my brother came, we all came from all corners. And I discovered that she was a Quaker. And I thought, Quakers are not fanatics and maniacs. I know that. So I decided to get to know her. Most people think it was the other way around. Most people think that, I came to Quakers because of Eva, but it was the other way around. I decided Eva was worth getting to know because I knew about Quakers. And so gradually, bit by bit, and then I moved to Bristol, and the only person I knew in Bristol was Arthur Peacock. Do you remember Arthur, Roger? Yeah. And so I thought,
Roger, muted. Roger, you're muted.
I think probably the last time I saw Arthur was at Eleanor Brunton's funeral.
Quite possibly.
He and Danny were there, which was lovely to see them.
Yeah. They're still together. Very much in Manchester.
Yeah.
But he was. So I thought. So what do? Do I say hello, Arthur, but I don't want anything to do with your Quaker rubbish. Do I say hello, Arthur, and get dragged in slowly, or do I just arrive at the regular meeting where I knew he was, coming, and just pretend like I've always been around, and then nobody will ask me any questions. And that's what I decided to do, and that I've been there ever since. A few times I've had a few months off in high dudgeon about something or another, but I'm still there. So yes, and the reason I joined was because when I got to know Mike through a discussion group that some of the younger Quakers had at Grace Lewis's house, and he had arrived from High Wycombe, and at first I didn't. He's a lot older than me, so I just sort of thought, oh well, that company. Didn't realise he had intentions. So when we were about to get married, I thought, well, I better join before we get married, because otherwise people will think that I joined because of him. But they wouldn't think that. I realised later. But and also I'm very bad at making decisions. And since I was making all sorts of decisions, like buying a house, getting married, changing jobs, I thought, well, one more decision, we might as well do this one as well. So, and then at the time, I used to say that I would, I joined to lower the tone a bit. So I joined, and I really wasn't sure. I thought I wouldn't be accepted because I didn't really think I was a pacifist, because I couldn't think what else my parents could have done or what England could have done in World War II. And and I think people are having the same kind of discussions now about Ukraine, really. So, but anyway, they didn't turn me down. So, yeah, and then I just got involved in lots of different things, as one does in Quakers. Yeah, so that's why Quakers.
Right, thank you. Roger.
I'd just like to share a little anecdote of that time. I was a teacher at Lawrence Western School in the science department, and a man I knew from Redland came to take a temporary chemistry job, and it was Mike. And in the discussion, it was a fairly informal situation. It was because it was just a temporary job, and but in the informal discussion, he referred to his fiancée, and I said, because I didn't know that was happening. I was very pleased.
Yeah, we were never officially engaged. We didn't see the point.
No,
I think we took about 6 weeks to do whatever preparations we needed, and I had to do most of those because Mike was teaching at the Saffron Walden.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
But then I think it's one of the first DIY type weddings. Again, it's there are quite a few things that we did that were regarded quite outrageous and now kind of quite common things to do. like no presents, please, just bring some food along.
Yeah.
Yes, so that was, yeah. So that was.
So
where we were all up to time. Another time, what I could do, I could talk about any of the books that I did, and that might be an interesting topic in itself.
Do you enjoy being a granny?
Yeah, I do. Well, sort of at times, I do now because they're actually quite civilized and they appreciate things. And because I just give them money for their birthdays, they like that. But they're much more appreciative now. There have been times when they weren't really very appreciative, and I would have arrived and they'd be very excited at me coming, and Jack would say, "Hello, Granny. Did you have a good journey?" And then he would vanish to his room to get on with his phone or iPad or whatever. And Roshan would say, "Granny, you've got split ends." And then she would vanish to do whatever she was doing. So they weren't particularly. I didn't really feel I had that much of a relationship with them because Ed was too far away. So yeah, it was just, but I think I'm lucky that even though we had such a not very good relationship when Anna was a teenager, that we have a lovely relationship now. I just feel very, 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 very grateful for that. And the kids, they're coming along as well. So I did,
I,
very,
if I may say so, I think Anna has the same rebellious spirit you had yourself.
yes. Yeah, and maybe even more. But I'm quite happy with that, really, because there are friends of mine who are a bit the same, whose children have chosen to be ultra conformist, and sort of Tory voters and all sorts of things that would be really hard to contemplate. So I think she's there. I think she's great. I think she's had quite a tough time because the men in her life have not actually have not come up to scratch, really. And neither of the men in her life take much interest in the kids. And I think that's been very difficult for them and for Anna. So yeah, I'm aware that we're kind of up to time. There's lots more I can tell you.
Patsy?
I've got one question I would still like to ask. Marian, is there something you still really want to do and you're determined you're going to do it?
Well, I'm not sure if I'll get there, but I've always wanted to go to Japan. I was going to go in 2020, along with the United Nations Crime Congress. And I had my fare already paid, and I had a week in a hotel all booked, and I had the Quaker Center in Tokyo already booked. And then it was all cancelled because of COVID. And then the result was an online conference in 2021, which was pretty gruesome for me. Very difficult to get into. And even when we were trying to do our presentation, I couldn't present my slides because of some technical hitch. But then Nick McGeorge couldn't present his slides, by which time my internet had kind of come back on. So I presented his slides. But it was pretty gruesome, and so all that. I still would like to go, but I don't know if that would be possible, or whether everybody will say, you naughty person getting on a plane. And the other thing, which is unfinished business, is I was going to do a lecture tour in Australia, and that's a bit of unfinished business. Whether that's worth doing or whether that's an opportunity that's been and gone, I don't know. And then, of course, there's lots of other things, sort of more homely things to do. I'm in the middle of trying to get all my restorative justice stuff together to go to Warwick University. I thought it would take me 6 months, but here I am, still in the middle of it, 18 months later. So in between everything else and the kind of talks and things, that's still to do. Roger?
You're talking of Australia. If you do actually get to Australia, I'm sure that the Friends Centre at Silver Wattle, it would be worth visiting. I've not been there. I had an invitation, but I didn't see myself getting to Australia. And I'm sure that they would welcome you with open arms.
Oh, right.
Trying to remember the name of the friend who's. But if you Googled Silver Wattle, I think you'll probably find it.
Okay. It's sort of thing that Google wouldn't have many versions of that.
No, not many, I don't think. Well, anyway, I'll see if I can dig out the details. I'm on their Facebook page. So
right.
That's good. Yeah.
One of the friends here today has had an interesting tour in Japan. That is Hattie, who has gave us 2 wonderful talks on it, which are well worth looking at.
Which I did attend, and I think I still have a whole bundle of documents. I put them in the box labeled plans for Japan. So, any more questions? Mary's got a question.
Mary?
Marian, could you tell us something about your interview with Radio 4 on the 24th of March?
Yes, I mean that's the title is Charity and Moral Duty, and I was put onto it by Katu Pedder, who is the National Media Officer. She and Paul Parker. I think they were approached for a Quaker, and they thought of me, and they thought of Jan Arians, and the program picked me because the stuff I've done is more community-based and hands-on. Jan Arians is the person who started Lifelines. So I think it's an accident through Katu being part of Red Meeting. So I think that's how that happened. So that's on the 24th at 11 o'clock in the evening. And if you don't fancy that time, it'll be on BBC Sounds after that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be there.
Hattie?
Yeah. Some little questions, because the sound quality on my system's not great. I missed a joke, partly because I'm deaf and partly because of the sound problems. When Mike was working at Bristol at British Aerospace, you said he pronounced something or other. He was working on liquids.
Yes.
And he pronounced something.
It was P.
Sorry?
It was P.
TEA?
No, P. PEE. Strange yellow liquid was found in between the outer skin and the inner skin of an aircraft. It could be something really dangerous and some really, really difficult structural issue.
Nitric acid.
However, he did all the tests and pronounced it was P. And they all breathed a sigh of relief because it meant that all it was a leaky loo. There you go.
I just really couldn't get that.
Yeah,
well,
I
different.
still want to get around to doing a biography of Mike, but I'm just so kind of full of other things to do that it doesn't happen. Yeah.
Another little inquiry. Dora's middle name is Minna, M-I-N-N-A, I saw. And I only know one other Minna, and I never heard of that name before. Do you know anything about that name?
No. I guess it's somewhere in the family history. I could try looking it up. So I know I've never questioned it. It's funny that, isn't it? I could have asked her.
I have a feeling that it's more common name in Germany than it is here. A friend of Hilda's called her washing machine Minna.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense, because there isn't anybody that springs to mind of the names that I've come across on the kind of family tree going back.
And then when you were talking about Serbia, you said they had introduced a law making youth justice accessible. And the word youth was so difficult for me to work out what you were saying that finally I reckoned you were talking about that because you used the word young.
Yeah.
So is that right, that they didn't really have any youth justice before then, whenever then was?
No, they did have youth justice system, but they didn't have well-developed community alternatives to locking people up. So they didn't, on the whole, they didn't seem to regard youth crime as particularly serious. And I think probably because of the wars and so on, that they had actually encountered more youth crime. I mean, that sort of seems to be true in the aftermath of conflicts. That always, I don't know where, how and why youth crime goes up. I think it's sort of because things are just generally a bit more dislocated. And they didn't seem to have very much arranged. They didn't have a community service. They had a sort of supervision thing, but it didn't work very well. People didn't come round very often. And they thought they needed to kind of beef up the kind of community side of things. And restorative justice seemed a humane and modern way of doing it. And so people were looking into it, and it started off with a small group as that was exploring it, and then they had a grant from UNICEF to do more and more, so I ended up doing quite a lot. But then that also needs to be accompanied by a sort of government political will, and it got as far as including it as an option in a new youth justice law. So you could be fined, you could be you could pay compensation, you could be punished in this and that and the other way, but you could also do restorative justice. But I don't think they made the kind of arrangements for putting the law into practice. You need to in England, if you have a new law, it's always accompanied then by a whole raft of sort of regulations that make it possible. You will appoint this person, that person to do this, that, the other. You will arrange, for this and that, the other to be published. You will arrange this. You will have available locally, etc., etc. And they didn't do that bit. They never got around to that. And so, I mean, and you kind of see that very often here, that there are good ideas, there are people doing wonderful things, but there's no political will to spread it around. In fact, just think about restorative justice. They are doing as much as they can to kick it into the long grass. By at the moment they're requiring all cases, serious cases, to be reassessed nationally, but there's only 2 people to do it. So the Bristol service has to send up these cases, and they disappear for months on end, and then somebody who knows nothing about it, whatever, will pronounce on it and say, yes, it can go ahead, or no, it can't. And by that time, the victim has lost interest, and the offender is in some other part of the country, and it doesn't go ahead for practical reasons. But I think they do this deliberately. We don't want to legislate against it, because that would look bad. So they just make as many technical difficulties as they can to just make life difficult, to like I say, kick it into the long grass. And I mean, governments, they do that with all sorts of other things. They have a law, but they don't enact it, or there's no money, or there's all sorts of ways of not actually activating things that are can be statutorily on the books and look good, but if there's no follow-up, then it doesn't happen. Roger.
What Marian just described is called Dr. Doolittle's Post Office. Those of you who know your Hugh Lofting, one of his books was Dr. Doolittle's Post Office, and he introduced a post office to a country that didn't have one, and offices and letter boxes and so on. But nobody got round to thinking about collecting the mail from the letter boxes. So they would fill up and get knocked over by cows, and letters would spill all over the road. Not the only Hugh Lofting story that stuck in my mind for 80 years.
I mean, that could describe sort of most of our public services at the moment.
Well, quite.
Yes.
Right then, friends, we have come to that certain hour, or that time when we come to the natural break, I think. Next week, another interesting time beckons us as Roger is going to regale us on a Quaker family in Bristol. Who
Yes,
could it be, I ask? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it.
And,
I've still got to do some work to put it together, but David, I'll hope to have some photographs.
Thank you, David, for managing the photos.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you very much.
Marian, fascinating, very interesting. Some of which I knew, of course, but it's there were a lot of gaps that I didn't.
Yeah. Okay, it's been good fun.
Thank you.
Very much, Patsy.
Next week.
Thank you, Anne.